I wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on and recognise any other people or families with connection to the lands of the ACT and region. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are listening today. Welcome to Safety Spotlight, a podcast from WorkSafe ACT. If you've just discovered us, we cover a broad range of topics around workplace health and safety. It is for everyone, whether you're an industry professional, an employer, an employee. We really try to keep clear of the jargon and distill the importance of building and maintaining a strong, healthy safety culture and the challenges around it. We really try to make it relatable. My name's Lish Fejer, I'm your host, and today we're going to dive into what really happens when someone is injured at work and what it takes from the employer's perspective as well as the employees to get them back into safe, meaningful, sustainable, enjoyable, connected work. There's a gap between policy practice and lived experience of workers, so we're going to explore where those gaps are and how we can close them. We're also going to look at how workers' compensation plays into all of this. Joining me today in this discussion, Alistair Grant, President of the Australian Rehabilitation Providers Association, ARPA, that's a bit easier to say, the ACT branch of that. He's been working in the field for decades. He's a qualified occupational therapist. He also runs a thing called Good to Go, getting people back into workplaces, making them good to go. And our other guest, Peggy Cheong, Acting ACT Work Health and Safety Commissioner, overseeing regulation of workplace health and safety across the territory here in Canberra. But also, this applies to all workplaces. I want to start first by looking at the landscape, just a broad brush view. How prevalent is work-related injury or disease in Australia?
Well, Lish, I have some figures here. You probably won't like it much, but more than 500,000 Australians sustain work-related injury annually and at an estimated economic cost of about $61.8 billion. So there's a lot of us, a lot of injured people who sustain injuries at work. 500,000 people. Yes.
That's an extraordinary amount. And the cost to the economy.
I have that too, Lish. The 61.8 billion, and also the workers' comp system bears about 9 billion of that per annum.
Okay, do we know who's most at risk in those stats?
Yeah, we get some really good data out of Safe Work Australia. So they're really able to help us understand cause of injury, industry profiles where injuries occurring. We even get to understand severity of injury. So to sort of add to what Peggy's figures are there, of those 500,000, we know that 100,000 of those people have what we would class as a significant injury. So that takes greater than 6 weeks for that person to be able to return to work. And that's where you start to see those costs really starting to stack up, because that's an employer now that has to think about someone who can't facilitate the role they're employed to do. So either they have to replace that, they have to substitute that with somebody else, or that work goes undone for that period of time. And there's also the additional cost, right, of that person. Their wages need to be covered. The compensation schemes do that, as Peggy pointed to, with $9 billion cost. Some of those schemes are actually now running to a point of deficit where they're struggling to remain viable. So our modern day work practices and returning these people to work is critical. And the skills that go into that, it's not a simple science. It's not as simple as just saying, well, that's Jimmy and Jimmy needs to do this job, because there is a breakdown in terms of Jimmy's capacity to do that job. They now have functional deficit. We need to return that capability. And how do you do that in a way that's safe and that Jimmy has trust and confidence in? That's the bit that we see break down time and time again.
Gee, I'm glad we've got a podcast on this, because you have just dropped a whole pile of conversation topics that we really need to unpick to get to the bottom of it. The workers' compensation, and you mentioned that a lot of these schemes are at risk of perhaps not being able to fully fund the recovery. What are we seeing in workers' compensation in Australia? How does it work?
Well, Lish, there are two types of compensation scheme. There is what we usually call risk states, which means that the scheme is underwritten by private insurers. ACT is one of those. There's about 3 of them in Australia. So what that means is insurers such as CGU, GIO, Allianz, they underwrite an employer's liability to pay compensation under our Workers' Compact. And then on the other side, there is the what we call non-risk states, which are government-funded workers' compensation scheme. Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia. If you read the news, they're at breaking point. The cost of the workers' comp scheme for non-risk states is too high. And I think as evidence, and Alistair may agree with me, that there's a number of amendments going through New South Wales at the moment to try and limit the type of claims that workers can make for mental health injuries. Because, Alistair will still back me up, I hope, mental health claims are usually much more costly than physical claims, and the time off work is usually longer. So that's the two types of workers' comp insurer throughout Australia.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Peggy said there, and I think their schemes are genuinely struggling. New South Wales is currently going through its reforms. It's piggybacking on some that were made in Victoria, so they've seen that ability to look at an act that was designed in 1987 was mainly thinking about physical injury, right? Workers' compensation, when it was designed, was to think about someone who falls, breaks their leg, they need an opportunity to get better, and they need a scheme that can support them, and good Australian egalitarian principles at play. But some of those things are now becoming really challenged when you look at mental health, and it's hard to make cause and effect in terms of how workplace has contributed to that injury. Is it the causal primary factor, or are there other things at play, no-fault schemes? So scheme design is really being challenged. And so scheme design is having to be reconsidered in terms of how do we make good on that in a 21st century working arrangement where there's gig economy, there's people working multiple jobs, there's really difficult work-life balance factors. We're all typically living in dual income households. We've got pressures that are different to maybe what they were in the 90s, and I plead ignorance in my age in some of that, but the reality is life is tough. That would be the general sentiment around the community. And when you factor that in with someone who has an injury that is of no fault of their own, which is the design of the scheme, and then they're trying to figure out how to pick up those pieces and get back into work, into life, it's complicated. And the schemes don't have a silver bullet.
It all points back to being safe in the first place.
Ideally, yeah. Prevention is way better than cure.
So let's start by being safe at work, or getting people back into work. Are we seeing the trends, that trend of 500,000 Australians injured every year? Is that trend getting worse, or are we getting safer?
In terms of statistics, my understanding is that we are on a whole performing as well as we ever have from a work health and safety point of view. So we're designing things and we're engineering out challenges that we would face in a workplace. The challenge that we're seeing more immediately, and this is something that ARPA really want to tackle through, Good to Go campaign that I can tell you a little bit more later about, there's that gap there in terms of employers and workers understanding, and even our primary healthcare clinicians understanding of how do you best return someone to work? How do you establish a return to work that is safe, sustainable, and in a position where that person doesn't feel like they're at risk? And that's the hardest thing that we look at. And there have been many different initiatives through time that have tried to tackle that. So Australasian Faculty of Occ Health and Environmental Medicine back in 2011, they built out the Health Benefits of Good Work, which was a piece of communication that was designed to really try and alleviate those concerns people might have about being in a workplace environment post-injury, and to really reinforce that work is good for us. As a construct, work is good for our health and well-being. It gives us an opportunity to participate, to perform, to feel connected to something. But at the time when we enter into these compensation schemes, we sometimes lose that concept. And then we get these general practitioners and primary healthcare clinicians that are working from a place of care and support for the client they're meeting. And that client tells them that, hey, work's dangerous. I've just been to work and I've been injured there. So from an advocacy position and a protection point, the easier answer is to say, well, let's just keep you out of there for a while. But what that does is then it creates scheme loading, scheme pressure, things that actually aren't helpful in terms of the long-term return to work. And then the health benefits of good work have got some really telling statistics. At 20 days, 70% chance that person returns to work. If we increase that to 45 days in terms of inability to return to work, they're now at a 50% chance to return. So there's some really great statistics there, and statistics we've known for the best part of 2 decades, but the cut through has been the challenging part. So we know that, so it's a what, but so what? How do we unlock that? How do we better perform to give people greater confidence, self-efficacy to want to return to those environments? And that's the gap that we still see as an industry body. And we've worked really hard in terms of doing industry roundtables. We do return to work roundtables annually as ARPA to try and talk to regulators, to talk to employers, talk to insurers, going, what's the missing piece here? And from what we understand, it's really about empowerment of employers.
So we're going to get onto the barriers and challenges, what stops people, and then I'd love to hear all your case studies of what has got people across the line and what's got them good to go. Because as you point out, it's not just money in your pocket, it's purpose, it's social connection, it's so much more.
People like Alistair and others do try and find ways to, keep people at work, and safe work will mean that there's less claims. I suppose what is concerning is that the return to work percentage of people have dropped. In 2021, about 91 or 92% returns to work after a work injury. In last year is 88.9%. So it's a small percentage, but you're talking about a large pool. So that is concerning.
Do we know why?
Well, that's what we're here to talk about, I think. Why people become disconnected. I think what Alistair pointed to really early on is when someone's been off work, the longer they stay off work, chance of them going back to work decreases exponentially, in my view, because they've lost that connection. I mean, we spend a third of our lives at work, and when you can't go to work, you're at home. What do? You don't go in and have a coffee with your mate or, talk about the football the night before. While you're at work, there's still that social connection, that interaction. And you don't have that anymore. And the longer you don't have that, I think, Alistair, the least you're likely to go back to work, and you lose that confidence, I think.
Safe Work Australia's National Return to Work Survey gives us really important data. And Peggy and Alistair, I'd love you to throw some more data into the mix because it's quite alarming but also really insightful. What are the key insights you're taking away from recent findings? What surprised you, and what does the data tell us about the workers' experience?
Yeah, I think Peggy really highlighted some really troubling statistics there in terms of that we are seeing a decline in our return to work capability. There is no less effort that schemes are pouring in to trying to support that return to work capability. There is more engagement, across scheme than I've probably ever witnessed, and yet we still see that there is that declining rate for workers, and trying to understand what is it that is enabling that or creating for that. I don't think that's something that we've immediately put our finger on because, as I said, the health benefits of good work has been around for near on 2 decades. The National Return to Work Strategy was designed in 2019 for a 2020 to 2030 sort of rollout. And there was a lot of really good guiding principles within that. I think the challenge is guiding principles is only giving us so much. Guiding principles is only telling us how you could do something. But what I think we really need to evolve to is telling people how they should do something, what they can do and how, and being more instructional in terms of what information we're providing, because we've still got to remember that most workers and employers, this is their first experience of a workplace injury, and they're trying to play a very rapid game of catch up. They're largely led by what their primary healthcare clinicians are telling them or their insurers are telling them. And a lot of it will come down to that worker's experience. So if that worker's experience is work equals harm, being there is challenging for me, they're going to ask for them to stay removed from that workplace. They're not conscious of those things about the health benefits of good work or a declining return to work rate or scheme deficit. That's not in their immediate picture, right? Their immediate picture is self-preservation. So we need to come up with ways of helping and showing that being in the workplace is good, and that they're going to get a lot of benefit from that will far outweigh any potential challenge or consequence. And, that's why there's a whole industry of rehab providers out there to help try and alleviate those challenges for people, to say it will feel daunting. It will feel unusual to go back to a place where maybe there is an element of trust breakdown or concern because you've had injury. But trust us, we can help you. We'll work with you in an independent way that protects your agency and supports you to get back into a workplace. And we're out there. Our industry's been running for, well over 2 decades, early 90s kind of stuff. And we're still seeing that challenge exists, and you've got fully represented industry groups, but yet we've got a declining return to work rate. So we're throwing a lot at it. And I think that's, to me, where we've got to try and think about utilising a finite number of resources that we have to be more precise and to be more deliberate in how we can unlock the capabilities. And for me, a lot of that capability sits with the employers and the workers, being able to give them the tools.
Yeah, so the perception from the employer's perspective, how does that match with the workers' experience? Stuart, anything?
Well,
to
I've
add
got
there?
stats for you, Lish, because you mentioned the word stats. Of course, the declining return to work rate did come from the National Return to Work Survey last year. And also the survey found that workers with psychological injuries were significantly less likely to return to work, about 76.5%, compared with those who sustain physical injury, and just over 90% of those go back to work. So that's a significant, I think, disparity. And the survey also found that if we had return to work planning, the work that Alistair and his people does so importantly, those who had a proper or tailored return to work program were far more likely to return to work, 94%, compared to those without one, about 81%. Again, reminding you of the pool that, it doesn't seem a lot, but in the pool of the claim being so large is significant. And coming to what I think is the most important thing, which Alistair's pointed to as well, is employer support before even the claim lodgement. If there's support by the employer, almost always improves outcome, because the injured worker, I think, feel that they are being looked after, put as simply as that. So workers who receive support from their employer before even lodging a claim, so they've suffered the injury, there's usually a lag time. You look at how to treat the injury, you lodge a claim. The employer support means that there's a higher return to work rate of 51%, compared to those who receive no early assistance, which is 27%. That's almost half. I've been looking at these figures and I've been thinking, look, it really is that very early phase. As soon as the injury occurs, there needs to be attention, there needs to be support to maximise the good outcome of a return to work.
And that's both for physical injury and
Yes.
psychological injury.
Yeah, and what you'll see is a lot of those physical injuries, they'll have secondary psychological loading, right? Like there's things that we'll often talk about in a biopsychosocial lens is we're not just talking about the sprained wrist or the fractured arm. It's how that person feels about how that injury came to be. Is there any kind of feeling of injustice or, sense that my employer didn't do well enough to look after me? And once you get into that area, you've got so much more to unpick, and it doesn't just become a simple primary care matter. A lot of the injuries do resolve, right? So if we look at it from an 80-20 rule, 80% of the time, people go back with minimal complications. You're not really needing the rehab provider, all the extra wraparound. But there is those 20% of cases where you look at it and go, that actually requires 80% of the input from what the industry can actually provide, because there's a lot more complexity into it. There's a lot more layering that's going on.
To get employers on board to do that initial support, what's required?
Education, I think. I suppose the advice that if you help your worker, it will benefit your employment. It's really a change in mindset. It's not a hindrance or disadvantage. Accidents do happen, obviously. The workers' compensation is no fault scheme, so that you're not blaming anybody. It's about a quick access to financial support and medical treatment. But a lot of employer, especially I think small to mediums, but they have limited resources. They have to think about other workers, other profit or productivity, unlike a big corporation perhaps which has departments that can deal with it. It's, if they're stretched already as an employer as to what they need to do, it's hard to find the time to, I suppose, sit down and say to the worker, how can I help? What's happened? Can we look at some way we keep in touch even though you're not at work? Having thought about this, I think, as an employer, maybe they should think about, well, if I was the injured worker, what would I like to happen? And, see that through if possible. Not always possible because of constraints, but if we can turn the messaging around as to workers' comp claim need not cost you, it could actually bring your work unit closer.
How has the whole changing workplace affected this? Because people are working from home, digital environments, there's an ageing workforce. How does that play into the fact that employers feel this disconnection to their employees?
Yeah, I think workplace design has evolved as much as it ever has in the last decade. And yeah, I think there are sort of core constructs that people have looked at and thought, well, I'll have my protections in this way. And we introduced at the beginning of the podcast about insurance and how it works. And, there are two types of workers' comp within Australia. So a lot of employers would still look at a workers' comp like a fundamental insurance product, but it's not that. your scheme actually won't get you that support. If you have a poor claims experience, it will end up costing you more. And it will end up being in a situation where it actually makes it really difficult to run your business. So yes, it's there as a protection mechanism, but it's actually workers' compensation insurance. So it's more designed to support your workers and keeping them protected than as opposed to an insurance model for your business. And I think that's a really different dynamic, and it's something we probably need to start thinking about differently as employers, because a lot of those return to work enablers do reside with us as employers. And this is something that we strongly advocate for, and where we're trying to do is everything we can as ARPA to get more resourcing, more tools, more checklists in front of employers so that we can fast track their capability to do this stuff. Because we need to have that positive response really early in a claim. We need return to work planning early in a claim. We need culture to be a place where a worker says, I'm going back to that place because I believe I can do it and I trust that place is going to look after me. If they don't feel that way, we work in a system and a scheme that enables them to stay out of work. That's because the primary healthcare provider can continue to protect what capacity that person does or doesn't have. And the person who's going to best judge for their capacity is them. So until we can get them thinking differently and wanting to be back somewhere, it doesn't really change where we're at. So we need to look at things that enable self-efficacy, that enable someone to feel like I've got the right social supports. There is no injustice here. My employer's trying their best. I'm trying my best. I just need to get back in there as quick as I can.
So a lot of those barriers, I think we've talked about many of them throughout. Obviously, pain, emotional, fear of re-injury, psychological, how the colleagues will respond. There's so much returning to work early because of financial pressures. Can you point out just, I don't know whether it's a list off, but there's so many barriers to people going back, whether it's from the physician or the primary healthcare practitioner or their own feelings about it. What are those barriers? How many of them are there?
Well, you did a pretty good job. You got pretty far into the list. Yeah, look, a lot of it is about the job demand. It's about how that person feels about going back into that environment. Like we particularly use a tool that we like, which is the return to work obstacles and self-efficacy scale. And the reason why that is there are 10 core dimensions, and you've listed a number of them, but it talks about their relationship with their supervisor. It talks about their connection with medication and how that might complicate their performances. It talks about functional capacities that they do or don't have, fear of relapse. So am I going to get injured again? Because how I'm feeling now, I never want to feel this again. We need to understand that from an obstacle point, but we also need to understand how well that person right now could overcome that. Because you don't have to solve every problem for every person, because actually what you'll start to do is create dependency challenges. And that's something that our schemes can actually do quite well, unintendedly, but they will do it quite well. So you'll actually get poorer health outcomes typically in personal injury schemes than you will outside of personal injury schemes. So there is an enablement factor that happens in our world of work, and that's what we're trying to unpick and create for this element of mastery and capability, that the person doesn't become reliant in schemes. Because what can happen, and there's some really great research that was done in the early 2000s by Ken Mitchell about getting stuck, and a motivation paradox is how he described it. And so people end up getting in these positions of return to work ambivalence. It's not that they don't want to return to work, they don't know how. They're getting different information that's telling them about their capacity. Other people are imparting onto them how capable they are or aren't. They become reliant on treating providers who are continuing to tell them what they do or don't need to be successful. They're waiting on an employer to suddenly unlock this capability of, I can return to work and this is how it's going to happen. But as we've talked about, we're dealing with employers who often are dealing with this for the first time or don't have the resources or capacity. So it's not an easy solve.
All of what Alistair said, and also I think the other factor is fear, because there's still, I think, a stigma about being on workers' comp. Inclusion is part of why we're at work, and that social interaction is important. So I think in addition to that stigma about, I've been on workers' comp, are they going to treat me differently?
Yeah, 100%. I just want to back that up. Like I did a session with some OTs at Uni of Canberra last week, and one of the questions we got asked is, but aren't you just dealing with people who are, running the system or taking their time and just, and that sort of 60 minutes, there's these dodgy compo claimant bits. It's still alive and well in terms of the way people think about it. But I can assure you that is such a small number of individuals you would come to meet. And then at that point in time, it's less about the return to work discussion, because then it becomes more of an insurance engagement, right? It's about managing a claim, something entirely different. That's not the people we meet. Like, easily 95% plus they just want the opportunity to get back. But Peggy's right. It's that fear factor. It's the what if questions that start to burn. So some of our simplest graduated return to work plans can literally be about just returning that person into the place of work for an hour a week. So they can be involved in the team meeting. They can be around the discussion. They're not sitting at home thinking about, what are people talking about me? What are people saying about me? Because you're just creating this chasm. It's a psychological chasm of them being able to return, because physically they still can, but mentally, am I ready to go back? Can I face it? Because I'm worried about what people think.
What's the most common obstacle you see in workplaces in hindering that return to work?
I think a lot of employers don't know how to begin. I think a lot of employers look at it and think, this person's been injured, and so there's a fear factor from the employer side too, is to say, look, I don't want to bring Jimmy back in and hurt him again. I don't really know what I'm meant to do here, so I'm relying on my insurer to tell me what to do, or the GP to tell me what to do. And unfortunately, they're also fairly time poor and don't have the resources to support them. So we need to put more tools in front of these people.
Fear on both sides, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Because the employer doesn't want to do the wrong thing either. And I think what Alistair is doing with his Go to Work program,
Good to go. It says it
Yeah.
on the t-shirt.
Good to go.
That will inform employers, and I think that will help them understand. Really, it's a change of mindset. Look, yes, it's an interruption, but it shouldn't be forever, and we can turn it into a good result.
Yeah, so the tagline around it, good to go, we can't wait to have you back. So absolutely change of mindset, change of narrative as well, right? I don't have to be fearful, or I'm not now utilizing my insurance product to get me out of a tricky spot. It's saying something's happened, but there's a lot of things that we can control as a next step. So control your controllables. And what we're trying to give the employers awareness for is there is so much that they're still able to control, even in the face of something that is quite challenging and confronting for a first time. And so there's walkthroughs, there's guides, because no discredit to what's been attempted with priced initiatives, with strategies, overarching principles can only take you so far. It's the so what and the how to. That's the bit that we've really needed to try and evolve. It's taken us a number of years to get there from return to work roundtables, but it continued to be the discussion point of employers want and need more help.
Really interesting discussion. So you've no doubt seen good workplaces, and you've explored lots of those things. The good to go, we can't wait to have you back. Like that, something as simple as that, it seems quite difficult for a lot of employers to say. Is it something that's taught? How do you get this message out to everyone that needs to hear it?
Yeah, well, hopefully this campaign goes a long way to being able to do that and bringing things into a website, making it accessible. We're going to have to put on a fairly strong marketing engine to bring it out to people to understand it's available, it's there.
Management training, is it something that's put up on a PowerPoint?
There is management training. A lot of your insurers will offer training, regulators will offer training to be able to help put things in front of people to say, look, it doesn't have to be as complicated and as hard, but probably what you'll find is people don't realise they need or want that training until they need or want that training, and they're not always running, they're not all available, which is where we see that flexibility of being able to have a as-you-need acquisition of capability that's available through a website. I think that's a really good dynamic shift for us. And I think when it comes to those employers, these podcasts, these could be another great example of just putting things into people's airwaves and being in and around it, changing the conversation gradually to be less about the stigma and the fear that has perpetuated for a very long time.
And the PCBUs obviously have this requirement to look after the safety and health of their employees. What do they have to have in place from a regulation perspective?
Well, obviously the usual work health and safety requirements following the Work Health and Safety Act and making sure, it depends on the
Around
type
returning?
of employers.
Is it around, is there anything
Well, it
specific?
includes returning to work, obviously. You wouldn't be able to return someone to full duties if they've not been certified fit for full duties. And it's being able to provide those alternative duties. And that can be quite difficult, I think. Alistair may or may not agree, because, for example, you have a construction worker who suffered a physical injury. They can't do physical work, and they don't have neither the aptitude or training for sedentary or admin work. What can you do with them? And you don't want to give them demeaning duties because that would affect the other aspect of psychological health. We haven't even got to secondary psychological injuries yet. So it's about, trying to find something that will fit, that won't injure them some more. I think it can be done through a chain of consultation, talking to the rehab providers. That's where their role is critical, to be able to identify meaningful work that someone can do while they are recovering.
And you mentioned, Peggy, small to medium businesses, how hard that is for them because they've got limited roles.
Correct.
In a workplace. So getting that across the line. As an OT, trained OT, Alistair, what sort of things? And what do you see when teams go into workplaces to try and get someone back into meaningful work, but
the
at
challenge,
reduced capability?
Yeah, the challenge is exactly what Peggy pointed to, is around that concept of good work. So the health benefits of good work is a really important inclusion there, right? So we're not just saying getting people in and asking them to go and lick stamps on and place them on envelopes where no one sends mail anymore, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. But there's also fear factors that Peggy's talking to there, in terms of, if I am computer illiterate and you're going to go place me in an office with colleagues and ask me to do work that I am completely frightened of and don't know how to do, with no training, no resources, and you expect me to feel okay about that, like, that's probably going to be very challenging for me, right? So there's a lot of work that goes into that job design and that job carving of what could potentially be something that is still productive, that still helps and is still meaningful for that individual, that can have them reconnected with their colleagues. And there isn't a one simple answer, right? Like I said, there are times where we just literally have them come back to do team meetings for the first time and just be around the conversation. And that can be your most basic starting point, but it's something that can just help reconnect. And then you start to take your advantages forward of, as primary healthcare indicates to us that capacity is improving, that person's feeling better, there's more confidence, then you broaden out what things you're putting in front of them. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to go about it. I probably can't give you any one immediate case study as an OT, but yeah, there's a lot of things that you can do. There are schemes that have designed for capacities for employers to even have things like supernumerary capabilities. So New South Wales, for instance, have what they utilise as their CIRA vocational programs, and you can have return to work and recover assist, which guides employers and gives employers backup to be able to employ others to come in and cover for what that person can't do. And then you can engage them in more supernumerary tasks. That's less confronting than at that time for an employer to be able to do that. Equally, being able to engage rehab providers is at a no cost in a lot of schemes, because they don't want to penalise employers for going and getting specialist expertise if they need it. Where the penalty comes is if the effort isn't being made to help try and make that return to work happen. So they'll put a lot of loading on wages.
And this return to work, as I've mentioned before, lots of different workplace environments now. Return to work might be you work from home. Is that a bit of a brush off, or is it?
It's a risk. You got to be careful not to just be doing that as another form of isolation or disconnection. And again, if the task wasn't to be meaningful, that it's effectively the modern day licking stamps. So you got to be real careful. But I've seen things work where, even if it's about having people reconnect to their training, having people go and review swims, and being able to think about, well, where can I add value to this construction site at this point in time? So I'll review the swims, I'll give feedback, I'll do extraordinary reviews or audits where it doesn't physically require me to be in that area that could be challenging for me.
Okay, I want to play the devil's advocate here. What if an employer wants to seize the chance to get rid of an employee that's been difficult, and they think that perhaps by giving them less meaningful work, by making it uncomfortable, the employer will leave and their problem will go away?
They'll be breaching their work health and safety primary duty to care for their workers, Lish, because, you shouldn't, well, shouldn't take that opportunity because, someone who's really down in terms of with an injury, if you do that, you can break them. And there's a moral duty as well, in terms of someone who's injured from the first day or someone who's been working for you for 10 years. They are workers, and you do have, as a PCBU, an employer, a duty to make sure they're safe.
And that duty is definitely there, and you'd hope that that's how it plays out.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I'll give you a more realistic or pragmatic answer. If you want to go and play in that playground as a way to try and work through releasing yourself of a difficult employee, you are going to lose. It's called workers' comp.
So people will not just feel demoralised and...
Your claim will go longer. You'll have more costs. You'll have more loading into your premium. You will still have that employee at the end of the day, and you may have an employee with more of an issue with you than before. And there are things to support that person in being able to take you to task if you're not doing the things that are of the duty of care to support them. So, the legal frameworks are designed to support that person from being persecuted or mistreated after a workplace injury. It's not a place where you will win as an employer if that's what you're trying to do.
And the Workers' Compact does have some protection. The object is to return workers to work. I mean, that's a primary object. The basis of the workers' compensation legislation is to get people back to work. It's not to get rid of them, not to fob them off. It is not an alternative to Fair Work Australia in terms of... but you're right, there are employers who will do that. But
because if they're a small business and they've got a couple of employees, one can only do very limited stuff. They might. I'm just sort of putting it in the scenario of a cash-strapped small business.
It's a fair question.
Is looking.
I think if it's more about a challenge on resources and reapplication of capability, then that's a different equation, right? And that's where people like your rehab providers need to play a role in having fair and full discussions with employers and primary healthcare providers to say, is a return to work realistic for this person to be back in their same employment? And there are often times where it's not. Like, I employ people that are purely here within our workspace to be able to help people find their next job. And they can do that within a workers' compensation environment. What an employer needs to be mindful of, though, is they can't be the one creating that thrust or push toward that, because that does then move away from your duty of care and the primary conduct of what's expected in the acts. But if that person is unable to, we need to find good work. And the best thing we can do is find that person good work as soon as possible. And if that means being in a different environment entirely with a whole new employer, that's where specialist skill sets need to be engaged. And we'll do things like vocational assessments. We will do, labour market analysis. We can do work trials. We can do abilities for these people to re-engage in an environment that is going to be more successful and sustainable for them long term.
Probably more so on psychological claims too, in terms of sometimes those claimants, if it's in a very bad workplace, can't go back to that workplace, in which case that's where Alistair's work people and rehabilitation provider look at other potential employments. But that should not be the first thing that they look at, because it is on the employer. And when employer complains about the level of workers' compensation premiums, usually they increase because of bad outcomes or high compensation costs.
Peggy, no doubt you've got lots of case studies that have come through. I don't know if you can share a success story that sort of highlights...
I mean, from an industry point of view, I think there's a general success story that Peggy pointed to in the data, right? That where we are able to be involved, we can see what is a declining return to work rate that's at 88%, nominally nationally. That can bump up to 94% when we've got the right engagements. So to me, that's a success story in of itself without a particular case. If we talk to the psychological injury and that transition in careers, I've seen some fantastic outcomes for people where, unfortunately, they are not able to go back into that former environment. And we've got psychological capable staff members who are able to work with that person, take them through the acceptance of that is their challenge and they are going to need to transition, and then commit and make real positive changes in their life that doesn't then weigh them down into all the extra psychosocial factors of financial distress, relationship breakdown, that they reconnect them to a purpose and they re-establish an identity, albeit in a different form. So they're amazing stories, and there are plethoras out there. Like, you could go and knock on the door of any rehab provider and they will have, reams of them to want to tell you, because there are so many good news stories in our space. So yeah, plenty of different ones I could talk to, but I don't have a particular one off my brain, to be honest.
In the media, they always highlight the fraudulent claims, let me put it that way. I'm not saying they're not hurt, but they're probably portraying to be more hurt than they really are. They highlight those. That's what you see. Media doesn't tend to highlight the good stories, the great return to work outcomes and what have you. So that's a bit skewed. I think Alistair's right. An 88% return to work is not bad. We could do better, but it's not bad. Again, thinking of the pool, but it should be better. And I think we could do better with, the change in mindset for employers and employers working with insurers rather than washing their hands off an injured worker.
Yeah. And I think the things like perceived injustices and like trying to limit the number of significant injuries, because I think we are doing a fantastic job from work health safety across the country. We're seeing some as good a performance as we've ever seen in terms of workplace injury statistics, numbers. Where we're still challenged by is this connection to minimising the number that become a significant injury, so 6 weeks or more. So there's still a lot we can do from an industry group to be able to connect to our primary healthcare providers, connect to our employers, these pivotal people and who help to orchestrate what happens for that person next. So what's the next conversation in their ear? What's the next thing that they are then going to have thinking about their return to work journey? And if you make that a positive conversation, less of a stigma-based conversation, which our media has perpetuated for a long time, people will get more confident. They will realise that this will be a good news story for them. There is a happy ending at all of this, but we need to develop those skills fairly quickly, because a lot of these psychological injuries, they don't need to be as long or as costly as they are, but we get into this adversarial state and return to work ambivalence, the motivation paradox kicks off. And it's just we haven't done an effective job early to control the conversation and to help that person come back to the table, feel heard, be seen and recognised for what their challenges are, and to solve for those challenges.
I guess, Alistair, you've just sort of pointed out what employers can do, best practice, the one thing that they should understand and focus on when they have an injured worker and getting them back in. Anything else you'd like to add on that? Because if you had to say, okay, every employer, listen up, this is the one thing I want you to really focus in on, what would you tell them?
I think make it less about the worker and what is happening to the worker, and the worker's not, being adversarial with you because of this claim. I think the less we can personalise or sort of strip back that how personal we make that experience, I think the better. Easier said than done, especially for those smaller employers that you pointed to earlier, Lish. But I think we need to be able to strip back those challenges, simplify things, remove the fear. Remove the thing of, it's me employer versus Jimmy worker. We're working together in a situation that was no fault of anyone's. It's happened. We now have a problem to solve. The sooner that we collaborate and solve that problem together, the easier this all becomes. If we come at each other from our respective corners and want to slug it out and fight, we will lose. Both parties will lose.
Peggy, what would you tell an employer?
Well, thought about this, Lish. What Alistair says is right. Remove the fear and remove the blame. I think that sometimes employers, not overtly, but in their mind, they think, oh, why did you have an injury? All it takes is a little bit of connection, a little bit of ongoing inquiry to the worker. The number of times in my previous life as a lawyer where a worker says, I was injured, I didn't hear from my employer for 6 weeks. They didn't even, call me. I've worked there for 3 years. I've, busted my gut. A call doesn't take that much, even though they're unfit for work. Come and have morning tea or come to the toolbox talk and just involve them, because, yes, they're precious for employers. I don't take away from that. But they're also precious for workers. There's symptoms, there's pain, there's isolation. So continue to include them because they're still an employee. I mean, treat them as you would treat yourself if you've suffered an injury. Just take a little bit of time.
Clear communication is what I've heard as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of where we've got to with the good to go approach. It's giving people more tools. So there are even things like scripted conversations to give those employers about, so this is presenting, how would I then have that conversation? There's, really simple how-to guides of, this is the first conversation you'll have with your worker. Here's how you introduce that. here's how you can approach that. So we're trying to do what we can to alleviate those fear factors, because, as a rehab provider association, we can only be so much part of the answer. And the more that we can do up front, the less significant injuries, the less scheme deficit we have, and it protects the things that we all truly value as Australians, to be able to know that I go to work each and every day, and if an accident were to occur, I am protected. I am scared at the thought of what that could look like if we didn't have those protections in place, right? I don't want to go into a sort of personalised income protection type model that you see in other areas like the States. Like that could be really difficult to implement in Australia. So we need to protect these things. They're really good for us.
And the other thing, Lish, I think I should say also that I've heard again in my previous life from workers is that they're not told what's happening. Okay, so part of the support for workers should be timeliness in terms of provision of advice. What's the next step? Because, they'll sit at home and they'll just wonder if they don't know. So, while the employer communication is important, if the worker's not hearing from the rehab person or the insurer, maybe it's something the employer could, chase up for them. Again, it's time, I understand that, but the workers are afraid, they're injured, they can't work, cost of living, their livelihood's being threatened, and they don't know what's happening. So timeliness, collaboration, consultation, and giving the worker information that's going to assist is also very important.
Yeah. I mean, because we talked about fear a lot, right? And we've had that discussion about threat, and there's some really good psychological principles as to why that is. We are trying to avoid a situation of that person creating a fight, flight, or freeze response that they're going to be required, right? Human beings from the dawn of time have had that to try and avoid saber-tooths and to keep ourselves safe as cavemen. We've now evolved into a 21st century where a lot of our threat comes psychologically. And so we need to mitigate that ability for that person to get off into a fight, flight, or freeze response. We need to feed them information so they don't become fearful, so they feel safe, they feel supported.
If anyone needs further resources, of course, WorkSafe ACT has so many wonderful resources on their website. Just go to worksafe.act.gov.au. And ARPA also have lots of fantastic resources. People want to get in touch, good to go, get the program out.
Yeah, absolutely. So probably easiest for employers looking for more information, and I think this is a really important step. It's to go to Good Return to Work, RTW, so goodrtw.org.au. That's where you'll find all your good to go information. So that's where those guides, resources, tools, cheat sheets, checklists, return to work schedules, you name it, it's there. Additionally, if you look up ARPA, so ARPA, just plug that into your search engine. That's going to take you into our various resources. A lot of that is probably designed more to members, but there are white papers, there's research work in there talking about the employer experience, talking about how do we advance and improve on outcomes for workers and employers alike. And that's things like early intervention. There's a lot. There's a myriad of stuff in there. It's
been a really wonderful conversation. I've picked up early support from employers to their employees. Really, really is the game changer. Lots of communication, overcoming that fear. No doubt, listeners, you've picked up so many more as well. A huge thank you to you, Alistair Grant, for all your expertise and your insights. What it really takes to support an injured worker across the line to get them back into the workplace. And of course, Peggy, for all the work you do here at WorkSafe ACT. There are so many great resources. And if you found this valuable, please take a moment to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps more people find these conversations. And if you know a colleague or an employer or a safety professional who'd really benefit from listening to this, send it their way. If someone's going through a tough time, getting back to work, flick this off to them, because it's a really important conversation to have. Word of mouth is exactly how we spread this. All we have to do is say you're good to go.
And we can't wait to have you back.
We can't wait to have you back. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Lish.
Thanks, Lish.